A good friend of mine is both a lawyer and an accountant, and he is the expert in Saskatchewan that briefs other accountants and lawyers on what the tax changes are every year. And I talked to, his name's Mel Gershpacher, and he's like Abe Lincoln. He leans back and he twiddles his thumbs and he closes his eyes, and when he's talking to you, and I always said, Abe, you got to talk faster because I'm paying you $500 an hour. And he'd usually get going. But he has told me this is the most arcane, complex dump of tax changes he's seen in his 40 years of doing this. And we all have to have this done by the end of this calendar year. And make the changes that are going to be required that they're driving us to without even knowing whether the legislation is going to pass or not. And at the end of the day, I can assure you that my former colleagues in the House are going to fight this tooth and nail all the way through, simply because of a lot of the things that aren't fair about what they're doing. There might be the letter of the law, but no one has enforced it to date, and nor should they. The problem we're seeing from the agricultural side is focused mostly on the succession planning and what needs to be done. We're finally seeing an influx of young and beginning farmers into Canadian agriculture across the board, and this is going to halt that dead in its tracks. Or it will spur it to the point where prices are going to be driven down as you're forced to sell to some third party, multinational or someone else from another country, and not be able to keep it in the family. 98% of farms in Canada are still family owned and family run. Half of them are incorporated, but they're still family controlled and family run. And when you look at the supply managed side, chicken or feather and dairy industries, about 100% of them are incorporated because of the way their business structures around the quota value and so on are set up. And when the Liberals are now starting, and we haven't had a lot of chat about, and Corey mentioned it too, the passive income side, and I've asked some accountants to look at this. Does this include your agri-invest accounts? Because it's not being used, it's passive, and the value of quota itself, depending on how it's held. You borrow against it, but it's actually a passive investment. And if that's the case, that's going to create a whole new opening of Pandora's box here. The biggest concern, too, has always been, as has been stated by some of the experts, CRA follows the letter of the law. They don't make the law. Finance puts forward a package, and then CRA is bound by court order and by legislation to implement. So this comes down to the direction of finance. This could be changed. A lot of this could be changed by 1 hour sitting in the House of Commons and 1 hour in the Senate, because everyone agrees this has gone too far, too fast, too much. 75 days of consultation that no one knew about till about the final 2 weeks when they finally started to be public with what this was going on. A lot of that going public was driven by the accountants and legal professions across this country, and of course doctors who picked up the challenge and said, this is going to create a whole problem for us in the way they're going to tax our structures, and whether you need a doctor or not, you need them at times, and it's going to affect rural Canada far more than the large cities, and in seeing these doctors pull out. I've seen some studies in Atlantic Canada where as much as 28% of physicians that are on the ground there now will leave. They'll move to the US. We saw that happen a number of years ago. My mother was involved in the medical profession, and we saw a lot of doctors leave because of changes that we had in Saskatchewan, especially, and you guys remember that, chased our doctors out and they all went stateside, so did a lot of nurses. And we'll see that again if they bring in this arcane taxation. They're trying to create an us versus them situation. They talk a lot about the middle class and those struggling hard to join it should be upset with doctors and professionals and these damn rich farmers that make too much money. But what they've created now is that east-west conflict, rural-urban conflict, people that pay taxes, people that don't pay taxes, those that think they should get more. They've got unions on side because somehow they think business is scooping them and they're not getting enough, they never do. But at the end of the day, this is about fairness across the board. And as Drew pointed out, when taxes go up, the black market goes up and the actual taxes coming into the coffers go down. And you have less to spend on our social safety net. We all just saw the unfortunate demise of Energy East, the pipeline that was going to connect. I mean, 70% of it's already built, but we've got a mayor in Montreal who pumps billions of liters of raw sewage into the St. Lawrence, and yet he's concerned about a pipeline going through that has a safety record bar none. And it got stopped. It's done. It's finished. And they went on about how it was a market decision by the protector, but at the end of the day, it was the 11th hour addition of upstream and downstream carbon and GHG emissions that were going to have to be added to the pipeline in order to move forward. And that's a political move. That has nothing to do with the National Energy Program or Board that were supervising that. This is a political charge. And if you're going to start using, and it wasn't even federal money, this is a private sector investor, 15,000 jobs are at risk. There is actually a site cleared and an oil refinery sitting in pieces in St. John as we speak. Irving's bought this a couple of years ago on the strength of the fact that Energy East was going to move forward. We had okayed it. We were in final talks with Ontario. Quebec was still a problem. Denny Coderre hadn't raised his smarmy little face yet, but he did that soon. And so they bought this. They built this. It's ready to go. They've got an export facility all ready to be built and start moving Canadian oil out into the rest of the world, as well as starting to subvert a lot of the million barrels a day that come into Canada from offshore oil to be used using Western Canadian oil. That's what pays for our health care. That's what pays for our social programs. And all of a sudden, we've just shut that right down. So they've had a series of things in the last couple of weeks that are very concerning. We're starting to kill economic activity on pipelines. Now we're going to target economic activity that farmers and ranchers and doctors and other professional people seek to do under the guise of a small business. And one of the other things that, I think we're going to have to change this whole middle class thing to middle class and those struggling to stay in it, because they're just shot after shot that are taking us down. One of the things, and Corey talked about the criteria that CRA are being asked to look at when it comes to the viability of a business and where the taxation should be, but the biggest criteria they never look at is the risk factor. How many people run their own small business, whether it's a farm or whatever? The risk you take every day in agriculture, it's about markets and weather and so on, but now it's your own government is creating a level of risk that's going to make it tougher for you, more stressful for you to do what you need to do. And when your kids start to see the hell that mom and dad are going through to keep this thing operating, they're going to start walking away again. We're finally to a point where my kids look at the farm. My nephew is back doing that now. If I go to sell land to him, I can't anymore. It's going to cost me 73%. I have no more retirement money. So it's going to drive the asset value. We're finally to a point over the past 5 years where agricultural assets have finally caught up with debt, and that balance is starting to look really, really good. Farmers are still taking on debt, but they make those decisions based on their cash flow and year-to-year access. But at the end of the day, the asset-to-debt ratio is looking really good, but the big asset is in that land. And we're starting to see that going to be driven down, and I've seen studies by as much as 30% when I'm forced to sell to someone else other than my family. Even though I might give my family a little bit better deal, all of a sudden we're going to be price takers again, not price setters, on our biggest asset, our biggest retirement asset. So there's so many more questions to be asked, so many more things to be talked about, and that's why it's so important that people like you take advantage of this, and I want to thank Sheila and Holly for setting this up. Shoestring budget, last minute, but look at the amount of people that are out here just looking for information, and that is going to be problematic. Because even the experts like Corey can't tell you definitively what you should do. They can give you a list of parameters and say, here's your 3 best options, but the parameters on each one of those, according to CRA, are this wide, regardless of how the legislation comes in, and you're stuck somewhere in, this is the high tax end, this is the low tax end, and they're going to come out and say, oh, nope, here's who you are. And with CRA, you're guilty until you prove yourself innocent. So the paperwork that's going to be required to even make this thing work, Holly is going to, or Sheila is going to have to itemize every day if the kids did any chores, if they're going to do this sprinkling. On the farm, we don't call it sprinkling, we call it chores. And I remember as a kid, I did an hour in the morning before I got on the school bus. I did an hour and a half at night. It was just part of what you did. At 10 and 11 years old, we were riding down to our pasture and herding cows all day, checking fence. It's what you did. But now you're going to have to justify that. You're going to have to punch a time card for each and every kid on the farm. At 10 and 12 years old, we were driving the truck in the field, catching from the combine. It was a thrill to be at that age. I don't ever remember going back to school on time, and it shows in the crazy job that I did later on. I didn't have the education to do anything more. But, this is what's expected on the farm. Bill 6 took a big run at this and was very ill-timed and not well received, nor should it be, because you've got so-called experts in Edmonton trying to tell you what you can and cannot do on the farm and how you should. No one wants to put their kids at risk. We never do. But at the end of the day, it's a family operation, and that's why they call it the family farm. It's under duress, it's under stress, it's unneeded, and We're ill-prepared for it simply because it's coming at us out of left field, literally. We've got a government in Ottawa that is more interested in spending money and taking it from you than they are in being fiscally responsible. And that has to change. There's going to be a tremendous revolt sometime soon across Canada. We're seeing everybody under duress and under stress, paying more and getting less in services. And at the end of the day, this has to stop, and it stops with people like you taking advantage of these operations, taking advantage of petitions that are out there online to be signed and sent in. The Liberals are going to have a briefing. Bill Morneau is going to sit down with all of his Liberal caucus. Wayne Long was the MP from New Brunswick who dared go against them on this piece, and he's been stripped of committee. That's extra work he doesn't need to do. He can actually spend more time at home now, which is not a bad thing. But at the end of the day, they try to make an example of him where they claim to be all about diversity of opinion and so on, but when somebody does bring a diverse opinion based on what his constituents wants, he gets punished for it. So it's not do what I do, it's do what I say, Justin Trudeau. And that's unfortunate. Well, he gallivants around the world picking up awards for things he's never done. The rest of us are back here paying the bills. Bill Morneau has run up deficits directed by the platform and so on like that, and they've been very creative in how they account for them, but it's still double what they said it was going to be. And I can understand now why he's lost track of the money. He can't even remember he's got a chateau in France. He's been there a few times over the last couple of years, but damn, it just didn't exist. So I think probably what he's going to say to the folks on Monday is, look, we know that, if we push forward with this, we're going to lose the next election, but you've all got a free trip to France, and here's the address of my chateau you can all drop in. Bring your own wine, though. So it's going to be a watershed moment. If we allow the Liberals to get away with this, then what's next? The stress and strain that's coming on the family units across Canada from a number of different fronts are just almost insurmountable. You can check off a list. They seem to be running through, taking more and more charge of your life. I remember Justin's famous father, Pierre, who loved to give us the finger and wave at us and tell us he didn't need to sell our wheat, and he never did. But he used to say that the government of the day had no right to be in the bedrooms of the country. I think the government of the day has no right to be in your family business, and you should be running that to your best ability. I don't want to take up a whole lot more of your time. I know you'll have some very pointed questions to ask of Corey and others in the crowd, possibly, that may be able to answer them. But I want to end this with a little story, too, just like Drew did. On a lot of the travel that I did, doctors are taking this very hard. They're not going to tolerate this. They're not going to stand for this. They will move, as will business money will hemorrhage out of Canada. We're already seeing that. But on one of my last trips, I ran into 3 doctors that were sitting in the Air Canada Lounge in Toronto, and they'd just been to a symposium on the latest surgical techniques. And they were learning some of the new things. And the youngest surgeon there hadn't had a lot of experience, so he said to the other guys, he said, in my 5 years of surgery, he said, I found that librarians are the easiest people to operate on. He said, you open up a librarian, everything in there is alphabetized, there's an index. Not hard at all to work on a librarian. Next guy says, well, for me, it's engineers. He said, you open up an engineer, he said, everything's color-coded, there's a schematic, you pop out the yellow part, put in the other yellow part, you're back on the golf course in 45 minutes tops. And the oldest guy, he says, well, guys, I've been doing this for a lot of years. And he said, I've operated on a lot of people. But he said, by far, the easiest to operate on are Liberal politicians. They're heartless and spineless, and the head and the ass are interchangeable. Thank you.